Welcome to this edition of On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow at Tarleton State University, and we welcome you back this week for another edition of the show. Here we are in the middle of an election process, which will culminate here in less than 2 weeks. But in the midst of that, and while you're being bombarded by all kinds of state and national media in terms of the election, I wanted to take the opportunity this week and next week to focus on some critical issues that are happening right now in Texas, and issues that most likely will be at the focus of some efforts in the next legislative session to address. Before we get to our guests today, though, to do that, I want to remind you that you can listen to us right here on KTRL FM 90.5 each Sunday at noon, also online at tarletonradio.com. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, where we post related articles to the issues and the interviews that we have on the show. Also encourage you to look at podcasts that are available either through Amazon or also through SoundCloud, because they're always available, previous shows, but also this show will be available after the show airs on Sunday, where you can download and listen. So this week we welcome Dr. Melody Loya, who is the department chair of the Department of Social Work in our College of Health Sciences and Human Services here at Tarleton State. And I've asked her to come on the show today, not only because of her experience as in this field and her experience as a academic, but also a practitioner and someone that has focused on training people in the area of social work. But I wanted to start out by asking Dr. Loya to tell our listeners a little more about the type of work that social workers do in Texas. As we've seen on this show many times, when we dig into these areas, there's a disconnect sometimes from people and what they understand about what people do, or what state agencies provide, or what is actually going on, and what's the purpose of that work. And I think it's always helpful, and especially in this case, to kind of put some very concrete understanding there about what is social work, and then how is that carried out in the state of Texas. So welcome. We're glad to have you on the show. And that's our first question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Morrow, very much for allowing me to come on and visit, especially about social work. I'm passionate about the profession, and there truly are a lot of myths about the profession of social work. Many people don't know that we are a licensed profession, and to call yourself a social worker to begin with, you have to have a degree, either a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, and then get the license. And you cannot test for the license, take the exam, unless you have the appropriate degree. A lot of people think we only work in protective services, but we are found working with people across the lifespan. So we might work with a family who's trying to navigate having a baby in NICU, preemie that's in the hospital for weeks. The social worker can navigate all of that, all the way through end-of-life issues in hospice. We work with the justice system. We work in adoption and foster care, the military, the Veterans Administration, just across the lifespan. We also have, we can become licensed clinicians at the master's level. So I actually have a license to do therapy, and a lot of people don't know that either. So we can become licensed clinical social workers and provide therapeutic services.
So in terms of Texas as a state, and really the need for social work, I mean, I teach in the area of government and see some of the challenges. And how is this structured throughout the state in terms of social work itself? I mean, is this on a not just a state agency or state funded initiative, but is it divided up by county, or how is that structured in order to then address specific areas that you mentioned within different parts of the state?
Right. There are state agencies that hire and govern much of what we do, but there's also county agencies, and then a lot of private or individual agencies. Some of them are faith-based, many are not, but all of those services are there to support people in need. And as you mentioned, Texas is we rank one of the highest in uninsured folks. And so we don't have a lot of support systems in Texas. We are not very social service friendly. And so Pre-COVID, we already had a lot of inequality. We had a wide disparity in income, people without resources, and not a lot of support nets for those people. So a lot of private agencies end up picking up that slack. COVID has truly impacted that inequality and increased those challenges for people. With the high rate of uninsured people in Texas, many people have to use the ER, the emergency rooms, as their primary health care, which impacts not only their own health care, but ultimately our economy. When you have 5 million people without insurance, it's going to impact our economy overall.
So when we look at that in across the state and kind of the quality of life issues, I always kind of approach it that way and looking at what's the state's role in addressing critical social issues, because the end goal there is not, a lot of people I think confuse that with thinking that, okay, well, you're just providing things to people for free. They don't think about that they may not have access to that because there's something preventing them. Either it is their income, or either it's their employment status, or it's their lack of insurance that keeps them from having access. And so I try to frame it in terms of quality of life issues. But when we talk about some of the significant challenges in the state that social workers engage with, I know a lot of people will think, okay, working with children, working with in homes, and dealing with critical issues that are going on that may be affecting a child's well-being. But there's a lot of other areas, as you mentioned. But what are some of the most critical that we see in the state, both I think pre-pandemic and now that we're in this? I mean, some of those have certainly heightened in terms of the challenges that are there.
I think the higher level of poverty in the state of Texas, and ultimately that impacts all of us. And then there's a big disparity in access to services between urban areas and rural areas. So rural areas truly have difficulty having access to those services. So transportation might be an issue. We don't have a lot of public transportation. And so to get from rural Erath County into Stephenville, for example, for services can be a challenge. And so transportation is a huge issue. And I think people have a bit of a misconception about what welfare is. We hear welfare and we automatically think of those needs-based programs like Medicaid and TANF, food stamps, SNAP. But really welfare, social welfare, is much broader than that. So Medicare, Social Security, VA benefits, public education, subsidized student loans, all of those are forms of welfare. And I wish that we had a broader view of what welfare is. So we didn't just see it as the safety net programs, but we see it as programs that help lift people up out of poverty. One of the best tools to lift people out of poverty has been the earned income tax credit. And a lot of people wouldn't see that as a welfare program, but it is. So I think if we had a broader view of it and we could see that we all benefit if we are a more equal and just society.
But yeah, I agree with you about the term, because I think we're so used to hearing that, and for many people who look at that and then think, okay, well, uh, why are people not able to address these things and then be more independent in terms of being able to take care of all of the different issues? And I like to use the word well-being a lot, in that relates directly to quality of life. You know, how we, and I would assume, and please let me know here if I need to adjust this somewhat, but that social workers are out there doing what they're doing for that goal of a better well-being for individuals and families and communities, so that they can get to a level that they're not in need of a wide range of assistance. And of course that varies. I mean, I think sometimes in these conversations, people look at that in general ways and they think about, okay, well, the elderly, the disabled, children, there's a large portion of those resources and services that are going to help people that in some ways can't do some of the things that they need to do for themselves. But that being focused, to me, is a much healthier look at this in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. I don't know if that is a good approach or not. I'm just trying. I think I'm throwing that out there to say, how do we get people to think differently about this?
Well, and that resonates with me, because as a social worker, we are looking at enhancing people's social functioning, so enhancing their overall well-being. Because in the end, we truly do all benefit from that, from having equal opportunity. And so we think, well, they can just go pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but some people don't have the boots to do that. So to provide the supports early on for families so they don't get entrenched in poverty would be, to me, a much better solution than trying to put a Band-Aid on social issues after the fact.
Right, right. Well, let's turn to the issue at hand. So this past week, this Texas State Board of Social Work Examiners voted unanimously to change its code of conduct based on the recommendation of the governor. That this code of conduct establishes when a social worker may refuse to serve someone. So basically the code will no longer prohibit social workers from turning away clients on the basis of disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Now, the legislature in its last session that allowed the governor more latitude in terms of some of these issues related to state boards and that lead state agencies. So that's one part of this, but the other part of it is here you have a board that made this decision, and there seems to be a significant pushback on this in a number of ways. And so, in terms of that, I wanted to ask in the work in social work and the way that social workers go about doing their work, what is the direct impact of this?
The concern is that by changing our code of conduct, which is based on our code of ethics established by the National Association of Social Workers, that it opens the door for discriminatory practices. And that is totally antithetical to our profession. So our profession has core values: service, social justice, competency, the importance of human relationships, integrity, and the dignity and worth of all persons. And so when you look at those overarching core values, this change in our code of conduct gives permission for those to be violated. In a perfect world, it would not make a difference because all social workers should be living by those core values of the profession that they signed on to when they became licensed. But it's very concerning, and it could trickle down to other areas. So disabilities, gender identity, gender expression, LGBTQ plus issues. What's next? What's next on the list of people that we could discriminate against? And that code of conduct establishes the standards by which we are judged. And so I could be openly discriminatory towards these populations, and under the code of conduct, no one could make a complaint against me. And I just think that violates everything about the profession of social work and what we stand for.
So we know some of this, and I'm not asking you to get into the politics on this. That's my job on this show, and we try to look at it in an informative way. And so some of this is certainly motivated by that there has been a focus by those in governance against the LGBTQ or people who identify as LGBTQ. So we saw that several sessions ago when the transgender bathroom debate came up, and that kind of died in a special session because it was very clear it would have an economic impact on the state. But there still has been this an agenda really in trying to push back against the broadening of laws in order to be more inclusive and to not have gender identity or sexual orientation become an issue in terms of state services and in terms of protecting or maintaining or promoting a level of equality. So the one part, that's one part of it. And I think we can identify that there is a political focus there. And if you have, I think part of this would be, is that where's that coming from outside of, say, our political leaders? Is there a push within, among social workers, or are there people out there that are looking at this in a particular way? The other side of it that I just don't quite understand is the disability part. I mean, to me, this is going to be challenged probably in the courts based on discriminatory elements, not just on the LGBTQ, but I think also on disabilities. But I'm trying to wrap my head around how all this was thrown together in this way, and then you would have a unanimous decision by the board to to give social workers latitude into whether they engage with a person or not. Or again, another question would be process, right? How do you actually go about disabilities? Are and many of them are visible, but there are many that are not. So I don't know if you have any insight into that and how that actually affects the work that social workers do when they're out doing the jobs that they're doing.
I guess the long-term consequences of this remain to be seen, but like I started off with our core values, I truly hope that social workers would ignore that this is part of our code of conduct, giving them permission to discriminate. And we're trained to set aside personal values, so I don't have to change my value. I don't have to change my personal belief in something,
Mhm.
but I need to set that aside. And I really don't understand the focus on disability. And then, the LGBTQ plus community has had an uphill battle in Texas. I looked over the last legislative session, and there were a lot of bills put forth to protect rights they never made it out of committee or they weren't heard. And so I think that's just an uphill battle in this state. But at the end of the day, um, I hope social workers view clients as people and exercise that dignity and worth of all persons, and not decide on what person is of value and what person is not. Because if I'm not going to serve someone that I believe should not be living the way they're living, then that opens up the whole door
Right.
for, you know, all these other things that are immoral behaviors that may be based on my moral standards and not someone else's. So I hope that makes sense that
It does because it often, I would say it puts a lot more uh, pressure on social workers, because instead of just here's a need and I'm meeting that need, now those personal opinions or views, those things come into play, and is leaving it with that individual to make that decision. And really, I would say in a lot of the issues you're dealing with, some of those are life and death decisions. I mean, you're working, social workers are in areas where the services they could provide, and the resources and the guidance they provide could mean that difference in someone living or not. I mean, it becomes that critical at times, I think, and that places a heavy responsibility there on meeting a need, and it's basically saying we're making that conditional, because and the conditions are who you are, how you live, what you do, what you believe, or that kind of thing, and that is a slippery slope, and it
right.
just it opens it wide open. So earlier this year, I did an interview with the communications director for Equality Texas, and part of it was looking at the next legislative session in terms of their agenda to address LGBTQ issues. And this was actually coming out of after the Supreme Court ruling about employment law and the changes for worker protections and so forth. So I know certainly this is going to be on their agenda in terms of trying to propose legislation and get changes. Do you see any activity or work among either social workers or professional organizations that are connected to social workers, and where they're kind of landing on this? Uh, I, I ask that because my wife's a school teacher, and so she belongs to those professional associations that kind of track these things. And when government makes a decision that is not well received, then their work is to lobby and to try to address or change that. And so without necessarily getting into the politics of it, I'm more concerned of what do we see going forward in terms of how this might be addressed in the upcoming legislative session or within the profession itself.
Well, there's been a national outcry. It's been validating and encouraging to see how many people are advocating for social work as a profession in the state of Texas. So our largest professional group, the National Association of Social Workers, is rallying support, as is our Texas branch. And so there's going to be several forums, town halls, We also have some social workers in the legislature, and so I would suspect that there will be some legislation forthcoming based on these things that have happened in the last week. An online petition has garnered already over 15,000 signatures. So I think it's pulling people together, and people that have a stake in this are being asked to contact Governor Abbott's office and being asked to advocate with the Texas Behavioral Health Executive Council, which governs the Texas State Board of Social Work Examiners. There's a board meeting for the TBHEC coming up. And so people are being encouraged to use their voice. And so, and you can use your voice in either direction if you support it, because it really is, I see it as a professional issue that needs to be changed, that we need to go back to where we were and protect those. But at the end of the day, we have personal choices to make. And so I do see it coming down to some new legislation that would protect the rights of those folks not to be discriminated against. Because, you know, I always teach my students that you don't know the client really when they walk in the door. And so I'm working with a client and then suddenly find out that the underlying issue is that they're not getting along with their family because they've come out. Can I then dismiss that client and say, no, I don't want to work with you because I don't do that? The suicidal client that calls because they're struggling with their gender identity, I can say, no, I'm sorry, I don't do transgender. It just opens a whole can of worms. So I do think there will be some legislation to address it. But in the meantime, for me, it's a moral and a professional issue to uphold the standards of my profession.
One of this too, in a context here of other issues that I've been tracking as well. One of the things that I've continued to see since the last legislative session, and I'm anxious to see how some of these issues are going to be addressed. But we seem in our state to be part of its constricted resources, or how resources are allocated. But a lot of these affect social work. I mean, we've seen challenges with services that we deliver to children, to the elderly, to those with mental health issues. It just seems like that those who are having some level of struggle within our society, who are in most need of some of those services and those resources, there continue to be either obstacles put in the way, or the services are just not there. And for me, that's a very strong kind of open criticism of the way we see the role of government in this state. That while yes, we're challenged, with resources, we've got to find a way to use those resources related to quality of life, and that's not just getting everybody a job. I mean, there are limitations to that as well. And so I don't know. To me, it tells me that the profession that you're in and that you train people to do is a very challenging one in this state, and that it's and that we've got to all be aware and then advocate more to try to see more done to make that better, and to try to use whatever our focus of the role of government is, but it needs to have a bigger role in all of this. And I don't how and I just ask this, kind of in wrapping this up, but how do you prepare students and those who come who are going to go out and be social workers in this environment, and what are the kind of focal points to helping them understand the context like that they're going to be working in?
Yeah, we truly try to give them a holistic perspective of human need, human suffering, human possibility. And so from the micro level of working with individual families up to how do you write a policy brief that you could present to a legislator about the issues that impact your clients, teach them that policy impacts practice, and practice should impact policy. And so those things that happen at the top are not out of my reach. And I need to have a voice as a social worker and advocate for my clients. So we teach them those skills. Social work started out as a very macro-based profession with the settlement houses that went into communities and did try to enhance that social functioning. And so trying to get students to see that broader picture of, it's not just about the individual relationship with the adolescent that comes into my office that needs help, but what's going on with the family, what's going on in the community, what's happening at school. And so really training them with the tools they need to operate at multiple levels of practice. And that's really what sets social work apart from other professions, is we aren't just focused on that individual's functioning, but we should be also looking at the influences of policy, the influence of society, embedded structural inequalities, racism, sexism, ableism, all the isms that impact our clients. We really should be addressing those at all levels of practice. And so hopefully we're giving our students the tools to go out and do that with whatever population they decide to work with.
Well, I want to thank you for that insight, because I think that helps all of us broaden our understanding of social work and what not only what social workers engage in, but also the tools and the just the intellectual and I would say probably even spiritual engagement with it, because it is a service, and it definitely there has to be a concern and compassion for those in need to be able to do that kind of work. So I want to thank you for joining us today. This is excellent, and helping us to put this in context and look ahead and see how this might be addressed in the coming legislative session. So thank you, and I hope we can have you back on when we have other issues come up in social work in the state, because we do on this show move around from local to state to federal issues, but especially in Texas, some of the more challenging issues that kind of our rank and file person in the state may not just have all the information they need to make a good form a good opinion about what government should be doing in that area. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Morrow.
We are going to take a quick break, and we will be back with more On Politics.
Politics can be confusing, but On Politics with Eric Morrow has your back. Follow the show on Facebook. Search On Politics with Eric Morrow to stay up to date with the show and all the sources to follow right along.
T for Texas.
T for Texas is a Texas-based history podcast from historian Dr. T. Lindsay Baker. Find a new episode every Thursday morning wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow here at Tarleton State University, and right here each week at 12 noon on Sunday on KTRL 90.5 FM, streaming online at tarletonradio.com, and also available as a podcast through Amazon Podcast, or download or listen on SoundCloud, as well as connect with us on Facebook at On Politics with Eric Morrow. So we want to thank Dr. Loya again for joining us and giving us that insight into social work, some of the challenges that are currently happening with the recent decision by the Board of Social Work Examiners, as well as just understanding what social workers do and what are some of the current issues that they are facing in the state of Texas and in trying to do the work that they're doing. And as I said at the beginning of the show, we are focusing on other issues. You can get lots of information on what's going on with the election, and we're going to get to something about the election in just a moment. But of course, you can find all kinds of information about the third debate this past week and all kinds of analysis. And there are other issues and other things going on. And so that's where we can offer something unique to our listeners and to others through focusing on specific issues. In fact, next week, we're hoping to welcome Charlie Stenholm on the show, a great friend of Tarleton and a former congressman, to talk about rural health care, because that is such a significant issue here in Texas. But again, we are here to focus on issues that are critical in our region, around the state, and around the country as well. And one of those that came out this week that is related to the election is the use of information, of voting registration information, and the attempts at cyber attacks on our voting system coming from both Russia and China. And so Trump administration officials, Homeland Security officials have come out and identified this. There were several news conferences. There's numerous articles confirming this attempt to try to disrupt elections in this country. And of course, one of those was the use of open record voter registration information. So this was not necessarily related to a hack into secure data or anything like that, but it does raise concerns as well. And that was the use of cyber terrorists in Iran in trying to use voter intimidation. So sending out an email, which these are called perception hacks in the language. It's a way of trying to change people's view about the candidates or the elections through trying to influence them in some way, whether it's through emails or through social media. And so this email went to voters in Florida, registered voters in Florida, that was trying to influence them in some way in the way that they see the election, trying to influence them against President Trump, because some of these spoofed emails sent to Democratic voters were purported to be from pro-Trump far-right groups that were threatening, and saying, we know how you will vote and so on. These things are probably going to happen. This is going to be a regular thing that we're going to hear about over the next week as we get closer to the election, are these attempts by foreign governments or by cyber terrorist groups in other countries attempting to have some influence on the outcome of the election. Of course, the focus here is to be disruptive to not just the election itself, but to politics in this country and to the society as a whole in our engagement with politics, with elections, with, in this case, our trust of the outcome in voting. And so one of the things that I wanted to point out with this, because I heard a very good interview with the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli, in talking about the way that we need to understand this. So first of all, he was very clear in pointing out that if we have evidence, if we see things happen that are unusual, that are an attempt to influence voting in this way, emails, hacks, those kinds of things, then there is a reporting system that has been set up by the federal government through the Center for Information Security. And through this, you can go onto their website, cisa.gov, cisa.gov. And when you get there on that site, there's a button up on the upper right-hand corner that you can click to report cybersecurity events and concerns that you may have so that they can proceed to investigate if they're not doing so already. But the other thing that he was trying to emphasize here, what we've seen with these cyber attacks on anything related to state and local government, to voting in this case, and trying to get information or trying to have some kind of influence, is that we have not seen attacks that have interfered with actual casting of votes. Okay, and I think this is where our security agencies and government are very important at this time, because the system that we have often separates that kind of digital access. Okay, and let me explain what I'm talking about here, because we can give the example of how we vote here. I'm going to be an election judge here in about a week and a half, and I've been through the training. And when you go in to vote and they print out your ballot based on where you live, and you go to the machine and you enter that ballot, all of these systems are not directly connected virtually. They're not connected in a way that you can infiltrate into a particular thing. The voting equipment itself is a machine where you're putting your ballot into it, a paper ballot in which you're marking the ballot by using the digital screen. You are marking it. And once you mark it and you finish, it comes back out, and then you go and feed it into another machine that is actually tallying the votes. Okay, and it's tallying it right there on that piece of equipment. It's not tallying those votes and then sending that information off somewhere else. There's a secure system by which they view that, and then they report the vote. And then they'll, of course, certify the vote later on once all of the counting of the votes is done. The other part of this that was emphasized was that we're doing this differently across 50 plus states and territories because elections are administered by each state. So each state has different measures, different systems that they use down to the county level, down to the community level, in which it's very difficult. There's no standardization here. No standardization. The only standard is the integrity of the election and how you go about doing that, what equipment you use, what resources you use, and so on. That's going to vary from one state to another. So I think what we see in this, and this is what I want to emphasize, is we've got to be very careful during this time that we are maintaining our trust in our local and state officials to carry out these elections and to do them with integrity, to protect those elections, to know that we have systems in place because of that diversity in the way we carry out elections that make it very difficult for any foreign power to access that information, to try to influence, to try to change vote tallies and so forth. I think we really can see that, and we see Homeland Security and we see other departments of government that are affirming that. So I want us to really think about that when we hear about these attacks, that very often they're on ways to try to influence voters and what they do and their actions and their perceptions. That's why it's called a perception hack. You're trying to change the way people view the integrity of the election, or the way that they view the way the election is being handled, or to threaten, like the emails from Iran that were threatening some action towards someone if they voted in a particular way. So this is very critical to keep it in perspective, to kind of understand the complexity of it, but also to know that our state, local, and federal officials are working very hard to maintain the integrity of our voting, to the integrity of the outcome of our elections, and really focus on making sure, and I think this is why we'll never see a national system that is fully online or that's integrated, that will also not see online voting. I think online voting is something that just opens that up, just like we do online banking, that just creates another realm or sphere, I would say, in which there is the possibility of hacking into it and changing the outcome. That we're a long way away from that if it ever happens, because part of the security of our system is the fact that it is so disparate. It's so divided up. It's different from one state to the next, and it's disconnected. There's not this kind of seamless connection of the technology in terms of its accessibility online or via the potential of a hack. So please keep that in mind as you think about voting. Of course, we're seeing record turnout in early voting. That's great to see as well. But it's also important to understand that we need to understand these complex issues and really how they affect our perceptions of what is happening in our own country, and that our officials are working very hard to counter this and to make sure that we have a safe and secure election. So I want to turn now, as we wrap up the show today, to talk about another area that we've given some attention to in the past. And this, of course, is related to the election, but it's actually asking us to kind of look beyond the election and to look ahead. Some of this came out of a conversation I've had with a colleague in recent weeks on the area of civil religion. Okay, civil religion, and we've talked about it in this country on the show before, in this country, that civil religion is the symbols that align with our identity as Americans. Some may have some religious connotations, but they may take the kind of the place of religious symbols. And so some of these could be anything from the flag to "In God We Trust" on our money. It's those outward expressions that are common across our country that connect us to the idea of being an American, and have elements of patriotism. Yes, at times elements of nationalism as well. The other side of this is also in this conversation we were having was about shared values. And really looking at what provides the glue, what holds us together, what are areas and things that we can come together around to affirm what we share rather than what separates us. And I think this is very critical anytime we have a presidential election, we have national elections, and the outcome may not be what many people wanted. And certainly, given the partisan nature of our politics right now, looking at the numbers of support on both sides, Republican, Democrats, President Trump, former Vice President Biden, that there will be many people that no matter who wins, the outcome of this election will not be what they want. And our uniqueness here as Americans, for as long as we have existed as a nation, has been to accept the outcome of these elections. Now, we've had challenges and tensions and issues develop out of that in the past. We can go back to the 1800s and look at the impact of elections on what led to the Civil War and what followed the Civil War that had an impact on the nation as a whole. But if we look back over our history, we see this transition of power. We see the acceptance of outcomes, whether there's a transition of power or not. We move forward and we work within our political system in order to work for the outcomes that we want. But we do it in a way that attempts to find some continuity and some collaboration and work forward in identifying what we do share in common as residents of this country, as citizens of this nation. And so in this conversation that we were having over civil religion and shared values, what it made me think about as we approach the coming election is where are we going to find those things that we do share, and how is that going to guide us forward? And this is very challenging right now. And this is where my challenge comes to you as a listener and as a citizen of this country, and as hopefully someone engaged in what is happening and wanting to work toward beneficial outcomes for us all. And so the focus here in looking at this is for us to ask ourselves, what represents those ideals, those foundational ideals, the character and the values of who we are as Americans, as citizens of the United States, and supporters of what we have in terms of our freedom, in terms of our system of governance, in terms of our security as a country. And I go back to some of the things that we've looked at before. Some would say, and this is where the conversation led that I had with a colleague, that civil religion represents that we have all these symbols of America, of the United States of America, and those symbols represent those values. And that's challenging because we see many people using those symbols in ways that promote discord, in ways that promote limiting the freedoms of some people, in ways that even openly promote racism. And that's not good. That's using symbols that we all ascribe to or we all look to in inappropriate ways that are not about cohesiveness and about toleration and collaboration and community and engagement, but are much more about dividing us as a nation. On the other side of it, I go back to what we've discussed in terms of the role of higher education in a thriving democracy and the values that we do as a part of our civic engagement efforts here at Tarleton State. And just to read back through this list, I want you to reflect and think about these in terms of what we share with other human beings that live here together with us. And we're trying to emphasize the things that help us move forward in a productive way, not necessarily in a way that says we're always going to agree that the political and policy outcomes will always be what everyone wants, but that we still have these fundamental values that guide the way that we relate to each other. So that list includes dignity, humanity, decency, honesty, curiosity, imagination, wisdom, courage, community, participation, stewardship, resourcefulness, and hope. So these are critical values that, again, I would say in some sense are represented within those symbols that identify us for who we are. They're represented in our history. They're represented in the ideals that are foundational for our society and for how we've structured the way we live together and the way we govern ourselves. But they're also very, very critical in our conversations, in the work that we do together, in our collaborations, in all of the things that we do that help us lead our country and our society forward, that help us to find a way to work together, to appreciate each other, to respect each other, and to make this work, to find stability, to continually go back to those foundational ideals for which this country was established. And no matter what the outcome of an election, no matter what the outcome on a specific policy, we are still ultimately committed to those ideals and that we identify the values that we share that make this work. That's what I think is the challenge facing us in this election. The outcome is something that if we have this faith and trust in our system of governance, that we have to accept. If we are abiding by the rule of law, then we accept that outcome and we move forward. What I'm advocating here and what I'm emphasizing is that no matter what the outcome is, where we turn after the election is what we have in common. What we have in common as members of this society, as citizens of this nation, of what binds us together to be able collectively to work through our problems and challenges, to engage with the role of government, although we'll differ on what that role is on a variety of issues, but we work through those processes in order to maintain a stable country, to emphasize liberty of the people who are here, of all of us, and that we use the system that we have to work toward the outcomes that we want, not to circumvent it, not go beyond it, not resort to violence, not to take matters into our own hands, not to advocate that we restrict the freedom of others so that we can get what we want, that we maintain these ideals and these values in order for the benefit of us all. So that is what I am asking you to think about as we approach the election. Again, looking beyond the outcome. Okay, the outcome is going to be the outcome. It's going to be who wins the election in terms of the votes and the electoral college at the level of the president, and voting as we move further down in terms of national elections and elections in our states. But beyond that, our focus must be on how we make this work together and how we don't give up. We don't look at any of these outcomes as a deterioration and a slide away from who we should be and what we represent and the values that we share, but a need to reemphasize those values and to find ways to work together to address the challenges that are before us. So I ask you to reflect on that. I come back to that from time to time because it's a focus of the work that I do in teaching government classes, but also think it's a critical role that we have here on politics to not get into the mire of the partisanship that we see. Certainly we analyze it from time to time, but this is not a partisan show. It's not about picking sides. It's about having the level of analysis and the level of information we need to be able to remain committed to the processes that we have, to the system of governance that we have, and to find our way forward in working through that and identifying and understanding our shared values and who we are and why that is important for our society, for future generations, and for the world. So I want to thank you today for joining us on Politics. I invite you to be with us next week as we look forward to hosting Charlie Stenholm and talking about rural health care. But I also encourage you to go back and listen to previous episodes on SoundCloud or download where you get your podcast, and check us out on Facebook, where I will post some related articles to the issues that we've discussed today. That's it for me on politics. We'll look forward to being with you again next week right here on KTRL 90.5 FM.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from me, Taylor Welch.
And me, Carissa Cole. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.